John McMullen joined us again here at 4 o'clock on the Sports Bash to talk NFL, Eagles, and more here on 97.3 ESPN. Check out all of his work at 97.3ESPN.com, including his latest article about the Eagles' white whale, finding a 3-down running back. Check it out at 97.3ESPN.com and the 97.3 ESPN mobile app. John McMullen joins us on the Boardwalk Highlight. John, before we get into the Eagles, I got to know from you about another bird. So we've been talking about the situation with the turkey vulture that flew into an office of Stephen A's at ESPN and broke the window. And it's gotten to the point where people are sending us pictures of turkey vultures they've observed in the area. So how many, have you ever had a close encounter with a turkey vulture? And if you have, please tell us the story. If you haven't, then can you just tell us about turkey vultures in general?
No, I've never had a close encounter with a turkey vulture. I've certainly seen them.
You're missing out.
I've seen them too.
I'm certainly not going to. I'm not going to criticize this particular one for going after Stephen A. Smith. I think.
No, he's American hero.
Yeah, I think that's a logical path to take. It's certainly about football. I mean, Stephen shouldn't be talking about football. He's like Mike Francesa when he starts talking about football. Just everything is wrong. Just gaffe after gaffe after gaffe.
Well, that's a whole other level of being wrong.
Yeah.
I don't even think Stephen is on that level.
No, I don't know. He talks about retired players. It's pretty bad.
Well, see, John, here's the thing. That's partially his producer's fault. You know, guys like Steven and Mike Greenberg and those guys, they got a producer in their ear. Someone's got to be in their ear and giving them the wrong information sometimes.
Yeah, right. Well, but Stephen A. talks, man. He's not. You can't control that guy.
No.
Right.
I mean, you know, when we're in studio, we have you, Josh, in our ears. So, you know, the thing about producers is that they have to be paying attention to correct you.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, maybe you're right. Maybe they're not paying attention. Well, apparently the turkey vulture is okay, and he's going to be all right, and there was no incident, but except for a big broken window by a 20-pound bird flying at 25 miles an hour.
Yeah, and I'm glad. I'm glad it's okay. And I'm glad Steven's fine, too. I kid, but he's actually a nice man. He just doesn't know that much about sports outside basketball.
All right, John, well, let's get to football. So we have the convening of the NFL people for Picture Day this week. And, you know, one of the things that was said before Picture Day by Howie Rose and Doug Pederson was about one of the priorities of the Eagles is Carson Wentz, a contract extension. And I know for some people, John, it's very easy for them to forget how good Carson was in 2017. I know that moving forward, the Eagles understand that they didn't invest all the draft capital and all the resources in the not just drafting Wentz, but building around him just to not pay him. So, you know, how much do you feel like it is, shall I say, understated Carson Wentz's value to the franchise?
Yeah, it's actually pretty amazing if you consider where he was in 2017 before the ACL and the LCL. I mean, he was going to be the MVP of this league. And we always talked about Philadelphia winning a Super Bowl if it ever happened, the dispensation everybody would have. I'll tell you what, that didn't turn out to be true. Because a lot of people have forgotten what Carson Wentz did for this team that season. And I always talk about it. He did the heavy lifting, and Nick Foles was sort of like Mariano Rivera coming in and shutting the door, and he did a phenomenal job. You can't take that away from Nick Foles, but the Eagles aren't in the position they were in without Carson Wentz, and that's pretty evident. And that's why the organization, a lot of fans have wavered when Nick played well again last year, when he sort of saved the season, made the run towards the playoffs. The organization never wavered for a moment, and through any of it, through the ACL, the LCL, through the back injury. There's never even been an intimation inside those walls that they were thinking about changing directions. And I talked about it a lot last year. I think the only thing that would have changed that would have been a second consecutive Super Bowl. And then you sort of have to say, well, you just can't give up on a quarterback that has won 2 consecutive Super Bowls. If Nick Foles was able to turn that trick, then it would have been really, really difficult. But I'll say this, even if that happened, the people in that building would have still told you Carson Wentz is a better quarterback. And they would have been right. And I know people don't understand that, and they boil things down to the quarterback wins or quarterback loses. That's not what the NFL is. Carson's the better player. He's the better quarterback, and he'll be here for a very long time.
John, we know that also, you could argue that Doug Pederson, him and Wentz are attached at the hip. This was the guy the organization wanted the draft. Doug has been here so far for Wentz's entire career. But one of the things Doug admitted was that he was less aggressive in 2018 as he was the year before. He mentioned that to the media this week. So, how much do you think Doug Pederson has to improve, not just as a play caller, but his own handling of Wentz to help Wentz become a better quarterback?
Well, I think that's always any coach, even all the way up to Bill Belichick. There's always room to improve, and you always have to look at yourselves and self-scout and see what you did in certain situations. If it was a mistake, you have to learn from it. I think that's one of the positives of Doug Pederson as a whole. He really doesn't have the typical ego of an NFL coach, which is kind of rare. And that's always been, I think, a positive. As far as, and he said that today at the league meetings, as far as him thinking he wasn't quite as aggressive, I don't necessarily think it was that. I think if you look at the numbers, he was just as aggressive. What everybody else got more aggressive. So then it kind of shifts the landscape, because everyone saw how that helped Philadelphia in 2017. They said, okay, we have to start not giving up possessions. We have to do more of that. And that sort of permeated throughout the league. And I think that more impacted Philadelphia, and that was always going to happen. That's what this league is. We constantly use that term copycat. It not only is in relation to schemes and players and types of players and skill sets. It also is for how coaches are successful, and it's always been trending in that direction. I mean, if you think about the old school being, say, plus 50 on the field, and it's 4th and 1, and you're trying to punt the football and flip the field, well, it's 1970s NFL thinking, when it was not just pass the football all over the place. It was so easy to move the ball. So I think as a whole, that was always shifting. And when the Eagles had a ton of success with it, it just sort of ramped that up. And I think that impacted Philadelphia more than sort of Doug's lack of aggressiveness.
John, as well as him trying to stay on the cutting edge of his aggressiveness, in your article, you also said that he tried to talk about maximizing the team's 10 OTA practices and wants to continue to increase the work on situational football. He said he's always trying to tweak the schedule a little bit and keep the players on their toes and keep them engaged. Can you elaborate on that a little bit? Like, what's he constantly trying to adjust and work on as far as his off-season schedule, his practices, anything that you can think of that kind of separates him from the pack a little bit?
Well, you have to understand, when you're doing the same thing every day, it gets kind of boring. And then when you talk about the same thing every day, year after year after year, for veteran players, it gets really, really boring. And we always talk about the NFL grind. And that's what Doug tries to do as far as just the daily day of an NFL player, which is a lot more than just being on the practice field. You got meetings, you got weight room, you have to do all this ancillary stuff as well. And he tries to change the periods around just to give them a different feel, to make it seem a little bit different, which is probably, it's one of those little things that other coaches don't maybe consider, and maybe keeps the players a little bit more engaged. And then as far as situational work, coaches have generally looked at it for years as the off season is for teaching, and sort of training camp is for evaluation, and then you get into the regular season where you start obviously game planning and prepping for your opponent that week. Those are sort of the three different phases. Now that you have less time on field with the players, the NFL has become more about getting the situational football right, and that's what generally wins and loses games, whether it's third down play, red zone play. So now they're kind of putting more importance on situational football year-round because you have to get the guys ready for that, and you don't necessarily have the time you once did in training camp and in season because practices have been scaled back.
Yeah, Doug was asked about his young receivers. Obviously, the other receivers are getting a lot of the attention over the past couple months, but Pederson mentioned Braxton Miller, the former Ohio State quarterback and third-round pick, who was on the Eagles practice squad last season. Make of it what you will. You wrote that in your article, but is there anything there with Braxton Miller?
Well, I mean, if you think about where he was coming into this league as a third-round pick in Houston, that's a pretty valuable pick, and people thought he had a real opportunity to turn into a good receiver at this level, just from his physical skill set. Didn't work out down here. The Eagles picked him up and put him on the practice squad. And I thought it was interesting. Obviously, this team is set. When you talk about the starting receivers, barring injuries, it's going to be Alshon Jeffrey, Deshaun Jackson, Nelson Aguilar. They've actually put a large number of assets from a salary standpoint into that particular position. But then when you talk about the backups, and the backups are going to have to play at some point, you hope everyone stays healthy, but that's sort of a thoroughbred position. At some point, somebody's going to have a groin or a hamstring. It's going to keep them out a week or two. And then you start talking about the next guys, and I think the default is Mac Hollins and Shelton Gibson because they've been here. But he brought up Braxton Miller first, and we'll see how that works out. But I do think it maybe was a subconscious thing and tells you that they had him and he was practicing, and maybe they like him as a player, and he's got an opportunity to make some noise.
John McMullen, join us on the RoboCon hotline on 97.3 ESPN. You can follow him on Twitter for all your Eagles NFL coverage at JF McMullen on Twitter. Josh and with Ryan Rothstein filling in for Mike Gill here on the Sports Bash on 97.3 ESPN. John, also touched you on the Eagles. You're looking ahead now. We're less than a month away now from the NFL, start of the NFL draft, and I think that's where a lot of the fan base's focus is going to start switching to. And preliminarily, I kind of have to wonder, John, what the Eagles are going to do. In my opinion, my assumption right now, and you can tell me if this is right or wrong, my assumption is that because of last year, the fact that this team had so many injuries, my working assumption is that this Eagles team is going to focus on depth. They're going to focus on making sure they have better depth at the positions that last year there were so many injuries that it actually hurt the team because they didn't focus on that depth necessarily.
Well, it was kind of difficult, and Howie talked about this yesterday, Howie Roseman, for a number of years. Remember, they gave up significant assets to get Carson Wentz, and for a number of years now, they haven't had the typical number of draft picks that they usually have, and that's where it impacts is depth, and that's generally where your younger players are on your roster. So, yeah, they've had some issues, and now they're kind of the first year out of that situation where they have a normal amount of draft picks, and this will be an opportunity to sort of restock the cupboard. Now, as far as the first round, you always want to get an impactful player, even if you're picking at number 25. You want that guy to be a contributor. Might not be a starter, You look at Derek Barnett, who was 14 a couple years ago. He was not a starter as a rookie, but he was an impactful player. He was a big part of that defensive line rotation. So you always want your first-round pick to be a contributor, but you don't want to reach. And Howie also said that because there's some obvious needs. The most glaring is probably running back, but there's only one running back really rated as a first-round pick by most people, and that's Josh Jacobs. And let's face it, the odds are, even if the Eagles like him as a player, it's going to be difficult to get him at number 25. Then you start talking about the value. Is it worthwhile taking a running back that high in the draft, a running back who might not be a three-down running back? So all those add into the equation. From there, I think they've done a pretty good job in free agency of addressing most of the other obvious needs, so there's no need to reach for any particular position. And for that reason, I think it's still more likely than not, you think about how do the Eagles build their team, and it's offensive line, defensive line. So those would be the two most likely positions I think they go to early in the draft, in the first round. Now you have 2 picks in the second round as well. I think ultimately over those 3 picks, you'll see a running back at some point.
John, I want to switch gears a little bit here because I was reading up on some different things regarding Howie Roseman and how he's been spreading out money in the contracts that he's been handing out like Oprah over the past years, particularly this offseason. But how much do you know about this? Because I'm curious to kind of get your insight on it. But basically, he's essentially putting in fake years for these contracts. So it's like an odd structure with like the Ronald Darby contract. It's a 5-year deal, but it's not really a 5-year deal. They're pushing all the money later into the contract. Same with, D-Jack and Malik Jackson. They're pushing the money back into 2021, 2022. Are you following me here? Do you know more about this than I do? Because I tried to understand it.
It's not. Most NFL contracts are basically 2-year deals,
right?
No matter what you see, and agents want the big numbers out there, and you'll see 5-year deals constantly. Howie's a little more big with voidable years, so where your typical 5-year deal, big money deal, a team can generally get out of it by the 3rd year with little penalty from a salary cap standpoint. What Howie does is he creates these voidable years to spread out the signing bonus over the lengthy period, and that lowers your cap number in the short term. And then he puts these easy voids in. So if you say you're a running back, and I'm just using this as an example, and you get 300 yards in the season, well, the back 3 years of your contract will void. That's what he's been doing, and that's how he gets around. Always use the term kicking the can down the road.
Yeah.
Now, that assumes eventually the check is going to be due, so to speak, but not really, because you can continue this forever unless the NFL changes the way it does business, which is not going to happen. So ultimately, it's just a way to spread out that signing bonus and get the cap number down for the current year. And the Eagles and Howie Roseman gets a ton of credit. He's very good with the cap, but they're not the only team that uses these tricks. It's generally league-wide.
Is this really just for Carson's big signing day, or is this just to be smart? Like we want to keep open the current year and the following year as flexible as possible, and that's just what we're going to do regardless? Or does this have a lot to do with Carson's inevitable payday?
Some of it has to do with Carson's payday. I mean, there is a reality of the sort of, that big money is going to be due. So in Carson's standpoint, it's going to be, think about Nick Foles, perfect example. And you look at Nick's deal, 4 years, $88 million. You look at the signing bonus. That's the cost of doing business at that position in the NFL today for a starting quarterback that gets to a second contract. You look at Kirk Cousins, $28 million a year. What I just said, most contracts are 2 years, except for Kirk Cousins. He got the first fully guaranteed contract in the NFL, which was only 3 years, but still nonetheless, you're talking $28 million. Now, Carson's better than Kirk Cousins. So you kind of start there. The average annual value is going to be over that number. And the Eagles know that's coming down the pike. So they did have to clean up a certain number of things and create that kind of space. But that, again, that's an NFL sort of cost of doing business at that particular position. You know it's coming if you have a franchise quarterback, and you sort of shift into a different roster building mode. At that point, when you look at the age and some of the signings and the Eagles thinking the window is open and signing veteran players, whether it's getting them in by trade like Deshaun Jackson, but Vinny Curry, Andrew Sendejo, at that point, that kind of stuff probably stops. And then you have to rely a little bit more on your draft choices because it's more cost effective. So I think that's the biggest change. But if you got a star quarterback, the Eagles have a star quarterback, when you get to that second contract, you know you're going to be paying a lot of money, and that's what's going to happen to the Eagles.
He is John McMullen. He joins us every day on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline on 97.3 ESPN. 4 o'clock football at 4. Mike Gill will be back in the saddle with John tomorrow. Check out all of John's work at 97.3ESPN.com and follow him on Twitter at JFMcMullen. John, appreciate your time today, and you'll be back with Mike tomorrow.
All right. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.